My name is Kijana Woodard. Here's all my internet things. Like I said yesterday, I try to keep everything with my name pretty much standard so I can be found. I'm from Dallas. Been working for 16 years as a professional. The last 4 years I've been an independent consultant. Throughout my career I've worked at various size businesses, Fortune 500, smaller companies. The company I'm at right now is 50 people. And then a variety of industries, retail, dating, financial, and now the games industry. So that's pretty cool. A lot of different problem spaces. So I think yesterday I mentioned that I had written a RavenDB app with the OEM stuff where I worked at a cheerleading events. It's pretty high pressure. So V1 of that project, which didn't include Raven, it was actually subsonic against MySQL, I think. I was in the middle of the competition and found a bug in my code that crashed the program. When there's like 10,000 people in the stands like waiting for you to do something, that's a pretty high pressure coding situation. But I did have the advantage that nobody actually knew that I had a problem. So I'm going to attempt a demo today, but hopefully everything goes well. But I will not be trying to do any live coding like we saw earlier. That's just insane to me. But this is my second talk ever, and yesterday was my first talk ever. So let's go for the demo here. So talk about document-based messaging. But the first thing I want to kind of make clear is, I'm not trying to propose a solution that's just going to get rid of RavenMQ or MSMQ or Azure Service Bus. I mean, those products do a lot of stuff. They have a lot of capabilities. Unlike, I think it was said yesterday, RavenDB has a lot of features, but it doesn't mean it can do absolutely everything, right? I've actually used several of these. Including Rabbit and Tibco, and they do a lot. They all have their pluses and minuses, things that you have to live with, things that you have to learn, and RavenDB is just not going to do all of that. I'm also not trying to replace an entire messaging framework like in Service Bus or Mass Transit or BizTalk. Those do even more things for you on top of the transports that I just showed earlier. This is not a one-size-fits-all thing, but sometimes, you just don't have the messaging infrastructure in place, right? Say it's a side project for you, and you're working on something on your own on the weekends. You just don't already have the stuff at the ready. Say you do have the messaging infrastructure at work, but you can't use it, which sounds a little crazy, except for those of you who have worked at big Fortune 500 companies, where they've gone out and spent 7 figures on stuff like messaging infrastructure and then won't let anybody actually use it, right? Stuff sits on the shelf, or they're too scared to actually make configuration changes to it because now it's business critical, so no new people can get on it, right? Maybe you're running in the cloud. For in Service Bus, as far as I know, there's no, Jonathan, do you have any idea, have you heard about any cloud solutions for in Service Bus yet? Well, Azure Service Bus, I guess, that's true. But
also that was messaging.
Yeah, so it's a little bit tricky to run MSMQ in the cloud or these other things, and so, but if you want to go just pure, platform as a service or whatever, it may not be viable for you to do it. I mean, yes, you can go to a RabbitMQ provider. Yes, you could do some things. But sometimes you just don't want another dependency for your project, right? Again, if it's small or it's a small team, you just don't want to take on another thing that you have to learn and configure and support. And then I think often as developers, we kind of underestimate what adding a new dependency is going to be like on the ops team, because maybe we can like download something and get up and running in 10 minutes, and then we kind of turn it over to ops and say, yeah, you're going to have to deal with this for the next 3 years, right? And they're like, what is this? Right? So for whatever reason, you might not want to take on something else, but you want just a little bit of separation in your code. Like you want to be able to send emails slightly outside of the transaction of saving the data, or you want to process files, big files or images or something like that. Last year I worked on a project and I was kind of in this situation where I had a system up and I was running on Azure websites. I had RavenDB, but it was pretty much me as the only developer, and I just needed, I needed to send an email after something got saved, but it was like I didn't want to do all the work of getting a whole messaging infrastructure set up to turn over to no one because it was just me at the time. I didn't want to go through all that just to have this one extra thing. So I ended up doing something where I would save the original transaction with a little bit of data, and then I would send the email and then save another transaction saying that I had sent it, sort of giving me a little visibility of like, did something go wrong? I never actually noticed a point when it did go wrong, but that was just trying to like give myself a way out to figure out if something had happened. But I wish I had done a little better than that. So sometimes a saga is overkill too. David talked about sagas earlier, so this was actually the part of my slide, my presentation, where I was going to talk about sagas and what they mean and what they do, and so David already kind of went over all that this morning. So instead, I'll just interject with the concept that document databases and messaging sometimes seems hard. And I think the kind of a question came up during David's talk, and the question was like, well, what about the order of messages coming in? And like, well, you don't know what order they're going to come in, so now you have to handle that in your Saga processing and create sagas based on various things, right? So a lot of times when we talk to developers about messaging or document databases or any kind of alternative method of development at all, they kind of look like, wow, this is so much harder than what we're already doing. But a lot of that is just because the concepts are new, right? But then the other part of that is, messaging and document databases kind of force you to do a lot of thinking up front. Whereas in relational databases, you might not necessarily have to do that. One, because you know it, but two, Chris Marizik, who's on the forum a lot, I'm actually surprised he didn't show up here, but he often makes the point that there's basically one way to do things to model your data in a relational database. You're going to do third normal form. Well, you might do another one, but then your DBA is going to yell at you, right? So you're going to do it pretty much one way, and then later you're going to figure out all of the things that are going to happen, right? In messaging, like Dave was talking about earlier, just something like, how are we going to store comments? You actually have to sit down and think about it. Like for his blog, for my blog, for sure, you could just, hey, store the comments right in the document. It's not, you're not going to have any consistency problems with the flood of people like, trying to, make comments on your page, on one post. But in other situations, you might. So you actually have to sit there and think about, oh, should we do one document per comment? Should we do a bids and what do you like? The one that you showed where you have multiple instances. What was it called? Bids and auction and bids or whatever style. I think Oren had a blog about that a while ago. I think it was called auctions and bids. But similarly with like messaging, you have to think about, oh, great, we have this disconnected way of sending messages across a transport layer. Well, what if we have that so that if one side goes down, we won't lose a message? Okay, well, how long can it go down for? Well, how many messages are we going to process per second? Well, this many. How big are they? Well, this big. Okay, well, how much disk space do we have there? Well, we have this much. So that means we can do math and say, okay, that can be down for exactly 6 hours, and then we're going to have problems. We're going to start running out of disk space. Well, immediately you start thinking like, man, this is a lot of work to sit here and think through all this crap. But the other way you go about things is just, push stuff to production, and you're just basically building a future phone call for yourself at 2 a.m. in the morning at some indeterminate time in the future, right? Like you just launch the project and then, oh, damn, phone call, what's going on? And now you're looking through log files trying to, figure out what happened. On the Saga is overkill, Jimmy Bogard has a great post about an alternative to Sagas within Service Bus called about routing slips. So it's kind of a long URL, but if you Google Jimmy Bogard routing slips, then I think it's the first result. But the idea is that, with the Saga, you get a lot of dynamic, you have a lot of opportunity to sort of do dynamic lookups on, oh, this message arrived, but what state am I in? What am I going to do next? Okay, so you have a dynamic workflow that you kind of go through, right? A Saga, sometimes you'll see it referred to on the web as a process manager, and there's kind of a debate about whether it should not be called a Saga, but whatever. The Saga allows you to kind of do these complex workflows and have state that changes over time, et cetera, et cetera. But, sometimes like you actually know up front, I have these things to do, and I can sort of put them, if I can specify them up front at the beginning, and then everything can just flow from there. I really don't need any sort of dynamic logic to figure out what to do later, okay? So that's basically the idea of a routing slip from a technical point of view. From a real world point of view, a routing slip looks like this guy, right? It's just like the old inter-office mail where, at the beginning you go like, oh, it goes to this person, this person, this person, this person, and they're supposed to do something like sign it or review it or stamp it or whatever they do in offices, right? And when the person is done with it, they cross their name off the list and then put it back in the inter-office mail, and it goes to the next person and so forth and so on until it's done, right? So what I want to try to do is achieve that same sort of simple message routing just using RavenDB, right? Because I have this at my disposal, and I wanted to see whether it has enough facilities to sort of let me do this. So I started with a document, and sort of a meta comment is, whenever you're doing demos, like you have to kind of make up things, and it gets kind of weird, right? Like, so I just made up a task. The task has 3 sort of subtasks on it. Like you could, there's a number to square, a number to cube, and a number to quadruple. And then there's a set of steps where I can actually set the steps on it, right? So the steps look just like that. There's a square step, a cube step, and a quadruple step, right? This means nothing really, right? It's just a series of steps that I'm going to assign to be done, right? So I'm going to actually try to do the demo here, and then we'll talk about how it's all put together. Let's see. All right, I can't actually see it. All right, so in this top middle one is I have the sort of main, what I call the back end, and that's where sort of the messages emerge. For the purposes of the demo, I'm sort of inserting myself as like a mechanical Turk type of entity in the process. So some messages arrive with some numbers to do stuff to, and then I'm going to actually like fill out the routing steps, right? Over here is a square worker, and this one is a cube worker, and that one's a quadruple worker. And on the top there is RavenDB running. So if I have it set up so if I hit enter, then it'll push in some tasks. So I have a square and a cube and a quad task, and you kind of saw it like flip over here, right? So the square guy went, the cube guy went, and the quadruple guy went. So I can sit there and I can say like, oh, I just want you to do a square, and then the square guy goes, right? And I just want you to do cube guy goes, and I want you to do cube, square, or yes, cube, square, quadruple, and it'll go in that order, right? So I can kind of, for a case-by-case basis, I can make a decision, but like right up front say, all right, this is my message, here's all the steps I want you to take, here's the order of the steps, go. And then that's the sort of the end of the process manager logic. From that point forward, it's just kind of doing its things. I actually slowed things down just so you could see it. If I kind of come in here and do this, let's see, and do my steps, you can kind of see that it kind of pops pretty fast, right? You can't really tell that they're happening in order. So I just put something in the code so it would sleep so that you could actually see that it was going one by one in the steps, right? But that's kind of what it's doing. Let's see here. Okay. Okay. So that was built on 3 different RavenDB features, right? So there's scripted index results, the changes API, and unbounded results, the streaming API. Ooh, my clicker is not working. Scripted index results. I think this is one of the lesser known features in RavenDB. It's been out there for a little while, and I was pretty excited when it came out, but nobody really talks about it. About 3 weeks ago, somebody said, hey, I'm having trouble with SIR, S-I-R. And Oren responded, what's that? And I just laughed, and the guy said scripted index results, and I was like, okay, I don't know why it's used as little as it is, but the idea is that you can have a script that watches an index, and when changes happen, then you can run that script on that document and then do stuff. The way it works is you have to add the bundle, which is built into Raven. You just have to turn it on. You have an index of whatever thing you're going to watch, and then you add a script of what's going to happen, right? So here's the script that I have in this case. You give it the name of the task, or sorry, the index, so that's the task index. So that's the index it's going to run against with that scripted index prefix, right? The index itself is JavaScript. So I'm creating a new object, and I'm assigning the ID of this object to routing / plus the document ID of the task. Then the task ID is just a reference, so I know like what the original task was. Set the steps, set the updated date, and then I put document, which is storing this thing that I just created. And I thought it was pretty cool that I could just, in JavaScript, create an object with brackets, and then put it in, and Raven was like, okay, that's cool. You can also specify a delete script, which I didn't need one, but the idea is if the document and the index gets deleted, then it'll run that script, and you could do something like clean up the related document or whatever you wanted to do. So getting the script into the database, it's just a document. So it's literally open session, store it. I actually just had a private static property on the task index of the SIR index, and push that to the store, save changes. Pretty straightforward. The changes API. Has anybody actually used that in production? What was your experience?
Well, we kind of misused it actually, so
Okay.
it would be something.
Huh?
Would be something we can
Okay. Okay. That's true. But yeah, I've had actually a really good experience with it. After, I think there was a fix in 2.5 that solved some stuff of it kind of losing its connection. And after that, I've had pretty good experience with it. It's pretty easy to set up. On the document store, there's a changes function, and then you can say, well, in this case, from document starting with routing slash. So that's picking up the routing slash that I kind of added there. And then I subscribe and give it a function of what to do when there's a change there. You can also say, for a particular document, do something, or for all documents, do something, or for if there's a change on an index, do something, or if there's a change on a particular or all the indexes, do something. So that function there, I just define like this. So when the change comes in, I say, okay, open the session, and I load up the routing slip. So this ... is basically check and see whether this particular worker actually cares about this document. That's what happens in there. If it does, then it loads the task and does, in this case, it does this little, squaring operation. Wow. It does its business work. And then it adds some results to the routing slip and saves changes. It's done. So that square task you see right here is kind of interesting. Mauro yesterday, he was talking about shapes. And I kind of stumbled upon this feature by mistake once, and I actually like it. You can sort of specify another shape of a document that you want to consume in another place, right? So the square task doesn't actually even need to know about all the other stuff that the other tasks might need to deal with, right? It just knows about its little piece of the routing slip. So I can say, okay, hey, load a square task from that with that document ID. Well, it isn't a square task, it's a task, but it still loads right in. And I have my information in this process to work with. And I think that's a pretty neat concept. There's a general idea that you should share contract and schema and not class and type. But as developers with a compiled language, we kind of feel, oh, we'll just have our own NuGet repository, we'll put the class in there, and we'll just share it everywhere, right? And that seems to work at first. It kind of breaks down over time. I mean, one of the things that as developers, we're very good at pattern matching, right? So we kind of look at the world and we go like, oh, this kind of looks like this and this kind of looks like this. They're the same. Let's bring them together in one class. Well, often what we find, like Mauro's customer examples yesterday, is what we're really looking at is things that look the same right now. And we forget about the temporal nature of what we're doing, that the software is evolving as the business is evolving, and you actually have two different concepts of customers in two different spaces, but because they look similar now, we try to combine them and make them the same, because we want to be dry, right? We don't want to repeat ourselves. But for me, SRP trumps dry, right? So sometimes all of these principles come into conflict, and when they do, single responsibility trumps dry. In fact, I would say, like, if you're going to try to be dry, like, be dry within a context, right? That's where you want to be dry, not like everywhere. Because, if you take it to its absurd extremes, right? Like, you could say, like, well, we've already used the letter A in our project. Like, how dare you use the letter A again? Like, you got to stop somewhere, right? So you brought up a thing about missing messages, right? So I actually have another demo for that. Let's see here. Oh, good. If I go down to here and I kill him, and then I go up here, I can see like that the square guy pop over there. Yeah, so the square guy popped, but the cube guy didn't, right? And also the quadruple guy didn't either, because he's off, right? So it's just kind of sitting there. But if I bring him back up, he kind of comes up, and the connection for there's an overload where you can say, get messages when the changes API has some information. So that's popped out there. So now it's reconnected, but it missed its change, right? So I kind of wrote just a very simple other mode for the same worker that will just kind of shake things around, right? So like periodically it'll run and say there it went and shook the documents, woke everybody back up and said, hey, go look again, right? Basically it just touched the documents so that they would get another chance to operate on them, right? By the way, I really didn't want to go to Visual Studio, but I put in this little method here, and you can see where I'm changing from sleeping for 1,000 seconds, and then I can go back to, I can just type anything. It'll just toggle back between 1,000 milliseconds and 0 milliseconds. So that's actually kind of related to David's thing about IDs, and yeah, this is going to be hard to do. But I have this admin config document, and so that's just, there's no number, there's no identity, there's no anything, it's just admin/config. And in that document is just one thing saying what's my timeout rate. And I'm subscribing to that in all the workers so that when one worker updates it, it just broadcasts out to the other workers and they pick it up and they do their thing, right? But I've actually used this technique several times where I'll have like a Nancy API sitting there, and it's running inside of Top Shelf, and then I want to sort of control the Top Shelf service, right? So there's something that's doing whatever. I think one time I used it, I was actually processing records sort of like this with Raven. And so in Nancy, I could go in there, sort of change a few settings, and it would just get broadcast back down to the server, so I could change the operating parameters of the service on the fly, which is pretty nice to be able to say, slow down or speed up or do whatever without having to actually stop the service or even log on to the machine. There we go. Okay, so the streaming API that makes that sort of shake feature work is just this. And it says, go get all the documents starting with routing. Loop through them. So I have a stable result set that I'm looping through. I go to the first, go through each one of them and just say, like, are they in good shape? If they're in good shape, I just continue. If not, I shake them, which basically updates some properties on the document and store it back. And so that will then trigger the changes API to tell the tasks again to sort of do their thing. So, what else could we do here? Well, I could try to introduce parallel handling, where you could say, like, okay, instead of just an array of strings, I could have an array of array, and maybe like within the subarrays, like those things could be done in parallel and could sort of meet back up later, right? I could have like a queue per handler Where the way I have it working here was when I update a routing slip, update the routing slip, all the workers get it and look at it and go like, oh, do I care about this right now? No, throw it away, no, throw it away, no, throw it away. So, you know, that's possibly a little inefficient. I could make more scripted index results that made individual documents for each one of those. I could, you know, so that they could all have their own little work queue, basically. You know, error queues, like what if there's a fatal message, what, you know, a poison message that's in the batch, putting it to the side so other work can continue. I could do that. Competing consumer, like what if I want to have like more than one of a particular type of worker working on documents? How do I distinguish between those? You know, smarter retries, like, oh, instead of just the shaking thing to sort of wake things up, like have something that's a little smarter. Right now I'm just running through all the documents that I've ever done and looking for good ones. I actually put in like 10,000 documents and it was still working pretty fast, and I was like, okay. But, you know, if I look at all these scenarios, if I start really going down this road, then like maybe I should just like think about using one of those other products that I talked about in the first place. You know, the case that I'm looking for here is like, I just need a little bit of flexibility to do a few things that are a little bit nasty to do otherwise, right? That's pretty much that. So any questions about?
Sorry to say, it's not like you had, you were checking the routing something, checking the chain.
Yeah.
You're looking at the chain method on the routing.
Right.
It's kind of a broader question, but do you have a view on putting behavior into objects that you're resisting?
It doesn't bother me. I don't have any fast rules about it one way or another. Does anybody else have a fast rule about it? Because of this whole like shape thing, like I'm just kind of pulling the data in, and then if I happen to pull that into something that has behavior, whatever. I mean, I wouldn't say that it's something I normally do, but it certainly didn't like raise any red flags when I did it here. I actually didn't even think about it until you just said that. But normally I just have, you know, data in documents.
Your documents are kind of like
Usually, yeah, I usually don't, like, I'm not trying to store, you know, like an aggregate root or anything where that has all the behavior, but in theory you could. I don't know, Maro, have you ever just stored the entire aggregate root that has all the business behavior? Obviously the methods don't serialize, but do you deserialize and like give the documents to aggregate roots, or do you just, is there any thoughts about that?
We're currently simply storing the aggregate keys, and we are also storing all the events stream, because we are not really doing event sourcing because of the fact that currently the customer is not really comfortable without having no way to access the database or the document. So
Right.
we are storing the aggregates. As we are storing on each commit is the full.
Right. Right. Yeah. I don't have any particular prohibition against having methods on documents.
Like the only hard fast rule in that regard is that your logic in your entities from a design perspective, they can't be aware of their persistence.
Right.
So you can certainly have methods that act on the data in those classes or within the boundary of that aggregate, but you can't have something that says, I'm not going to go take in a RavenDB session and reach out to the database and pull something else. That would be where you violate the boundary.
we have pretty unique.
Yeah. There's a balance that line. It can be anemic or rich, but it has to be.
I mean, I'm sorry.
No, that's fine. You know, one thing you could do if you were worried about that sort of being a perception problem is something that I kind of joked about yesterday. But if you had a partial class, then it would be obvious, like, oh, this is the document part and this is the behavior part. You don't have to do that, right? But it's effectively the same thing, right? So you could always hydrate a document later with a different set of behavior if you wanted to. One place where behavior kind of helps that you see on the forums a lot is people will say, how do I do this crazy thing in an index? And usually, a lot of times, an easier way to do it is to sort of pre-calc it as like a read-only property in your document. So pre-calculate, like, I don't know, buckets of time. I don't want to step on anything you're about to say, but various things that you easily can do in C# up front, make it a read-only property, calculate it, and then you can index on that thing. So it's sort of a behavior or a business rule that's baked into your document.
Last point on
Yeah.
so we broke exactly what you just mentioned. We started lettering our rate method based on all those things, those properties that you can let me have. We're right about them. So it's handy to use sparingly, but
Right.
for an emergency.
Yeah.
For precisely the reason that people want to then sort on properties that were based on the
Right. Yeah, the JSON ignore thing gets particularly funny when you say, I'm going to have the JSON.NET JSON ignore because I don't want it to get serialized when I'm shipping it to JavaScript out of the front door of my MVC. But I'm going to have the Raven JSON ignore for it to get ignored when it's getting saved to RavenDB. And part of that problem is just because we're trying to use that one document to be all things. And if we, kind of explicitly did a transformer or whatever to get the shapes that we need for those situations, then, those problems kind of go away. You have more code to write, but now it's explicit, like, oh, this is a different shape. You don't have to kind of look at this document, make sense of all the JSON ignores and go like, oh, I see, in this situation, these are the properties that are in play. Like, it's just obvious, like, oh, okay, this is the view for this document in this case. More questions?
It's totally off topic, but expanding I really suggest to customer when they first try to go to domain-driven design is to, let's try something really strange. Let's say that aggregates do not have properties at all, do not have nothing public except methods with void return type. Because if you think about it, aggregates are just some hidden data, because it's the state of the aggregate, a lot of behavior. Rate model is the data that you are going to present to the UI of the user, but it's just a matter of the fact that you need to present something to the user. The most important thing that Eric Evans wants to underline is that there's a lot of behavior in aggregates, and to model that with just methods that return voids means that you have to think about what you want to do with that aggregate group, and not what you want to present with the aggregate group. It's not easy in the first part, and especially, for example, with the RavenDB, you tend to, in the end, you end to internal properties, because you want to live happy with indexing written in C#, and you do not want to expose those properties outside of your assembly so that no one can use it and no one can depend on your aggregate.
In your example, were you guys each of those workers updating the same document?
They were doing it because of the array of steps. They were doing it serially, so they never actually conflicted with each other. But yeah, they were updating the same document. Something else that I kind of hinted at was there was a results dictionary where I put a result in. Like, you could easily have the next worker sort of feed off of the previous worker's answers or whatever, that would be something that you could do as well. I think the Jimmy Bogart example was like at a restaurant, like you have like cook, prep, or prep, cook, pack. So basically it's moving down this assembly line.
Can we see the shape of one of those in Raven Studio?
Yeah, if I can find it. Dude is not going to be happy about that. Oh man, I'm gonna have to blow up another one. Let's see. So like here's the original task and then the routing task. So what I did to actually advance it was just remove the step from the steps array, and I put it into a completed array. That was just for tracking, where I could go back and see the history. You know, again, these demos kind of go out of control and you start adding features. You know, feature creeping yourself, right? So I can know all the stuff that that particular one went through. Click on it. Yeah, so there's some results that are in there. It was updated. Config document. Property. What else? Else? Okay, cool, thanks.